True scary stories from Reddit. The cursed radio that whispers secrets. The wind howled through the small, snow-covered town in the Midwest as Jacob Monroe drove his aging car along the narrow streets. The town, a cluster of modest homes and frostbitten trees, seemed frozen in time. Jacob, a reclusive writer in his early 30s, had come seeking inspiration, his mind dulled by years of creative stagnation in the bustling city. The journey to this isolated place wasn't just about writing his next novel. It was about escaping the noise of his former life. The house loomed at the end of a long, icy driveway. It was a Victorian relic, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. It had been left to him by his estranged uncle, a man Jacob barely remembered from childhood. He had hesitated before accepting the inheritance, but something about the opportunity to start fresh had felt right, almost faded. Inside, the house exuded an eerie charm. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of aged wood and disuse. As he explored, Jacob's steps echoed through empty halls. The attic, however, drew him most. Pushing open the creaky door, he found himself in a cramped, dimly lit space filled with forgotten relics. Among the boxes and discarded furniture was an antique radio. Its design was elaborate, with ornate dials and a brass speaker grill that gleamed faintly under the weak light of a single hanging bulb. The radio seemed out of place, like it had been carefully placed there rather than forgotten. Intrigued, Jacob wiped away the thick layer of dust, marveling at its craftsmanship. He didn't know much about antiques, but something about the radio struck a chord. He decided to bring it downstairs, imagining it as a quirky decoration for his sparsely furnished living room. That evening, after unpacking a few boxes, Jacob settled into an old armchair. The radio sat on the coffee table, a silent witness to the snowstorm raging outside. On a whim, he turned one of its dials. To his surprise, it still worked, or at least it powered on. A soft crackle of static filled the room, oddly soothing against the backdrop of the storm. He turned the dials, expecting to find a station, but the static didn't give way to music or news. Instead, faint whispers emerged. The voices were distorted, fragmented, and incomprehensible, as if they were coming from another dimension. Jacob furrowed his brow, leaning closer. It had to be interference, perhaps from a distant, fading signal. Amused, he chuckled and turned the radio off, chalking it up to the quirks of old technology. But the whispers lingered in his mind. That night, as he lay in bed, the sound seemed to replay in his ears. He dismissed it as an overactive imagination fueled by the solitude of the house and the stillness of the town. The next day passed uneventfully. Jacob spent hours setting up his workspace, arranging his notebooks and typewriter by the large window that overlooked the snowy yard. He had almost forgotten about the radio until night fell again, bringing with it a heavy silence that felt oppressive. Seeking distraction, he turned the radio back on, hoping for the odd comfort of static. This time, the whispers were clearer. They rose and fell like fragments of conversations just out of reach. He adjusted the dials, his fingers trembling slightly, but no music or coherent voices emerged. Then, amidst the eerie sounds, one word cut through the noise. Jacob. He froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It sounded old, cracked, and strangely familiar. His name had been spoken, and it wasn't a trick of the static. His heart raced, and a chill ran down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature outside. For several moments, Jacob stared at the radio, his mind scrambling for a logical explanation. A neighbor's signal? A coincidence? He turned the device off, but the unease didn't leave him. The house seemed to grow colder, and every creak of the floorboards felt amplified in the suffocating quiet. The following morning, Jacob rationalized the experience. He told himself it was interference or perhaps a prank by someone who had rigged the old radio before he arrived. Yet, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling that the radio was more than it seemed. Chapter 1. The broadcasts begin. The first few days in the old house were unremarkable, aside from the radio's strange whispers. Jacob Monroe brushed them off as quirks of a forgotten relic. Yet, the whispers had planted a seed of curiosity in his mind, one that grew with each passing day. Soon, the antique radio became more than a decoration. It became an obsession. Each evening, Jacob would sit in his living room, turning the dials. The static seemed alive, crackling with faint voices that ebbed and flowed like distant waves. At first, the fragments were incomprehensible, but over time, they began to take shape. Words emerged, then sentences. The whispers told stories. Stories of the town, its people, and its tragedies. One night, as the snow fell heavier than ever, Jacob caught the clearest broadcast yet. A soft, trembling voice spoke of a family who had once lived in his house decades ago. The narrator described the family's sudden disappearance. How one winter, without warning, every member had vanished, leaving behind untouched meals, burning candles, and an air of foreboding. The voice recounted how neighbors had searched the home, finding no sign of a struggle, no footprints in the snow. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Jacob's fingers trembled as he turned the radio off. The stories were unnerving, but oddly captivating, pulling him deeper into the house's history. The next morning, Jacob visited the local library to confirm the details. To his surprise, he found a dusty newspaper clipping from 1947 describing the same vanishing family. The article mentioned suspicions of foul play, but noted that no evidence had ever been found. That night, the whispers grew louder, as though the radio could sense Jacob's newfound interest. The stories now carried more urgency, recounting events with eerie clarity. Jacob began to notice a pattern. Each tragedy tied back to his home. Fires, drownings, even the disappearance of a young girl who had been playing in the backyard. All roads led to the same place. The townsfolk seemed to know more than they let on. At the grocery store, Jacob overheard hushed whispers about the cursed house. When he asked his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Carter, about the home, her face darkened. "That house has seen too much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just the walls that hold its history. It's something deeper, something alive." Mrs. Carter went on to share tales that had been passed down for generations. The most unsettling was about a previous owner who claimed to hear a voice from beyond through an old radio. According to her, the voice promised answers but demanded something in return. "It twists your mind," she warned. "It knows your secrets, your fears, and it always takes more than it gives." Jacob laughed nervously, dismissing her words as small-town folklore. But deep down, her warning gnawed at him. That night, the radio's broadcast took a sinister turn. The whispers began recounting events from Jacob's own life. Private moments, childhood memories, and even regrets he had never spoken aloud were laid bare. He felt exposed, as though the house itself was peeling back the layers of his mind. Each broadcast ended with the same chilling phrase: "You cannot hide." Sleep eluded Jacob. When he did drift off, his dreams were vivid and horrifying. He saw himself wandering through dark corridors that twisted and turned endlessly. Voices echoed around him, accusing, mocking, and pleading. When he woke, he often found himself drenched in sweat, his heartbeat racing. The final straw came when the radio began turning on by itself. No matter where he placed it or how many times he unplugged it, the whispers returned, relentless and growing louder. It was as though the radio had become a living entity, tethered to him in ways he couldn't explain. One freezing night, as the snowstorm outside reached its peak, the radio suddenly stopped its whispers and spoke in a clear, commanding voice. "Jacob," it said, sending a chill down his spine. "Go to the basement." He froze, the words reverberating through the room. The radio's tone was unlike anything he had heard before. Calm, deliberate, and insistent. Against every instinct, Jacob felt compelled to obey. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the basement door, his breath visible in the icy air. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dampness and decay. As Jacob scanned the room, the beam of his flashlight landed on an odd patch of floorboards near the far wall. They didn't match the rest of the wood, as though they had been hastily replaced. Kneeling down, he pressed his hands against the boards. They creaked under his weight, and with enough force, one of them gave way, revealing a small, rusted handle. Jacob's heart pounded as he pulled, the boards lifting to reveal a hidden trapdoor. Below, the darkness seemed alive, a void that swallowed the light from his flashlight. A faint, otherworldly hum emanated from within, growing louder as he stared. The radio upstairs began to play again, its static punctuated by distorted laughter and faint cries. Jacob took a deep breath and descended into the unknown. Chapter 2: The Hidden Truth. Jacob hesitated before stepping into the darkness beneath the trapdoor. The flashlight's narrow beam flickered as though reluctant to illuminate what lay below. The air was heavy and stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew and something else, something metallic like rust or old blood. At the bottom of the stairs, Jacob's foot hit solid ground. His flashlight swept across the space, revealing a secret room. The walls were lined with old, yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and shelves cluttered with dusty tapes. In the center of the room stood a small desk, atop which lay an open journal, its pages filled with cramped, frantic handwriting. Jacob picked up a photograph. It was a black and white image of a man sitting at the very desk in front of him, staring at the antique radio with a haunted expression. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo was a name: Edwin Monroe, his uncle. The journal proved even more unsettling. It was a record of Edwin's descent into obsession. One passage stood out. The radio isn't just a receiver. It's a bridge, a doorway. At first, it was a marvel, connecting me with voices from the past. But it isn't satisfied with listening. It demands to be heard, and it wants something in return. Jacob's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. One entry described a man, another previous occupant, who had claimed the radio could communicate with the dead. According to Edwin, the man had become consumed by the voices, convinced they held the key to unlocking life's mysteries. But as the man sought answers, the radio began to demand payment, tormenting him until he vanished without a trace. On a nearby shelf, Jacob found a box labeled recordings. He slid a tape into an ancient player on the desk and pressed play. The static-filled recording was nearly drowned out by the faint hum of the radio upstairs. "Please," a trembling voice begged on the tape. "I've given you everything. Just stop. Stop tormenting me." The voice broke into sobs, but the radio on the tape responded in its familiar, eerie tone. "Payment is due." Jacob felt a cold sweat run down his back. As the recording ended, he realized the faint hum of the radio wasn't coming from upstairs anymore. It was coming from the walls around him. Back in the main house, Jacob's world began to unravel. Time no longer behaved as it should. Clocks stopped working entirely or spun uncontrollably. Shadows danced across the walls, even when there was no source of light to cast them. His phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "The house remembers. Leave while you can." Jacob stared at the screen, heart pounding. The message was almost word for word what Mrs. Carter had warned him about. A second text followed moments later. "You can't run from what you are." The cryptic warnings only deepened Jacob's paranoia. The whispers from the radio grew sharper and more accusatory, calling him by name, taunting him with memories of his childhood, and hinting at dark secrets he didn't remember. He tried to turn the radio off, but the volume seemed to adjust itself, the whispers escalating into distorted, guttural commands. One night, in a fit of desperation, Jacob decided to destroy the radio. He smashed it with a hammer, reducing it to a heap of shattered tubes and splintered wood. Exhausted, he went to bed, hoping the nightmare was finally over. But the next morning, the radio was back, pristine and humming softly on the mantelpiece. Jacob's fear turned to anger. He hurled the radio into the fireplace and watched as flames engulfed it, the smell of burning plastic filling the air. Yet, when he turned back moments later, it was there again, untouched, as if mocking him. That evening, the whispers changed. They no longer spoke in fragmented sentences or riddles. Instead, the voice from the radio delivered a chilling message. "You can't destroy what binds us. The truth is in your blood. Jacob was losing his grip on reality. He avoided sleep, fearing the vivid nightmares that awaited him. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights felt like the house itself was alive, conspiring against him. The final broadcast came late one night. Jacob had just finished boarding up the basement, desperate to keep whatever secrets it held locked away. But the radio sprang to life, louder than ever. This time, the voice was clear and deliberate, speaking with an authority that froze Jacob in place. Edwin thought he could escape me. He couldn't. He gave you the house because he knew his time was up. But the house chose you, Jacob. You were always meant to be here. The voice paused, then added, "Payment is due." Jacob's mind raced. His uncle's disappearance, the strange inheritance, the cursed history of the house. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Before he could process the implications, the voice delivered its final, damning revelation. He didn't vanish. He's still here, waiting for you in the basement. Jacob's heart sank as a slow, rhythmic tapping began to echo from beneath the floorboards. It was faint at first, but grew louder with each passing second. The trapdoor he had sealed with nails and boards creaked ominously. And then, the whispers started again, louder than ever, drowning out his thoughts. Chapter 3. Facing the Curse. Jacob stood at the top of the basement stairs, the trapdoor creaking beneath his weight. The whispers had grown louder, insistent, their distorted words forming a singular chant. Face it. Face the truth. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of grim determination, Jacob descended once more into the depths of the house. This time, he knew there was no turning back. The room looked the same as before, but something felt different, charged, as if the air itself bristled with energy. He moved deeper, pushing aside a rusted cabinet that revealed a full-length mirror, its surface cracked in jagged lines. The sight sent a chill down his spine. The mirror wasn't just an ordinary object. Its fractured surface shimmered unnaturally, almost alive. When Jacob peered into it, he didn't just see his reflection. Behind him stood ghostly figures, men, women, and children, all staring at him with hollow eyes. As he watched, the figures began to move, their mouths forming silent words. Then, the whispers rose from the radio upstairs, carried through the walls, and synced with the mirror's visions. "You are the key," one of the figures whispered, stepping forward in the reflection. It was his uncle, Edwin, pale and sunken-eyed. "The curse isn't bound to the house. It's bound to you." Jacob staggered back, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "What do you mean?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. The whispers answered in unison. "The sins of the past demand balance. Your bloodline betrayed us." Jacob's mind reeled as the fragments of truth came together. His ancestors had owned this land centuries ago, exploiting the people who lived on it. When rebellion came, families sought revenge, leading to unspeakable acts of cruelty. The spirits of the wronged had been trapped ever since, using the radio to cry for justice. The radio's presence was no accident. It was a conduit, amplifying the anguish of those who had suffered. And Jacob, as the last of his line, was their final target. But the curse wasn't just vengeance. It was a desperate plea for closure. The mirror glowed brighter, its jagged edges pulsating. Edwin's reflection grew clearer, his expression shifting to something almost pleading. "Restore balance," he urged. "Break the cycle." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. He didn't ask for this. He didn't commit the sins of his ancestors. And yet, he understood that the burden was now his to bear. The radio upstairs crackled to life, its whispers growing into a deafening roar. "Offer yourself. End it." Jacob sat on the basement floor, staring at the mirror. He recorded a final message on his phone, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "To whoever finds this, I'm sorry. I didn't understand what this house really was or what it wanted from me. But I know now. The curse isn't just about vengeance. It's about justice. Maybe it's about peace. If you're hearing this, I hope I've succeeded. And I hope this place lets you go." He set the phone down and stood, gripping a shard of metal from the broken cabinet, Jacob faced the mirror. The figures behind the glass watched him, their eyes following his every move. He raised the shard high and brought it down with all his strength. The first blow sent cracks spidering across the mirror, the light from within flaring dangerously. As the mirror shattered, the room plunged into silence. The radio upstairs stopped humming. The air grew still, and for the first time since Jacob had entered the house, it felt peaceful. But as Jacob turned to leave, he caught movement in the remnants of the mirror. His reflection lingered, no longer cracked or distorted. It stood there grinning. "Thank you," it said, though Jacob's lips hadn't moved. Before he could react, the reflection disappeared. Jacob was left staring at an empty frame, the basement cold and silent around him. Jacob left the house the next morning, its windows dark and its secrets seemingly buried. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him from within. And though the radio no longer whispered, its presence lingered, waiting for the next visitor brave or foolish enough to listen. The snow fell softly over the small Midwest town, blanketing the old Monroe house in an eerie silence. Days had passed since Jacob's sudden disappearance, and his absence had become the latest whisper in the town's history. Locals speculated endlessly. Some claimed he had left without a word, unable to bear the isolation. Others muttered about the house's dark reputation, the curse they had long feared to speak of openly. When police searched the property, they found no signs of Jacob, only his phone resting on the basement floor, its final recording unfinished. The cryptic message left investigators unsettled, but without evidence of foul play, the case was quietly closed. Months later, the house stood empty again, its cold walls waiting for the next chapter in its story. The radio, untouched by time or decay, remained on the attic shelf, its glossy surface free of dust as though it had never been abandoned. Then, one crisp morning, a moving truck pulled into the driveway. A cheerful young couple and their curious child stepped out, their laughter cutting through the still air. Inside, as they explored their new home, the child wandered into the attic. His wide eyes fell on the antique radio, its intricate knobs and dials gleaming in the faint light. "Mom, Dad, look at this," he called, turning it on. At first, there was only static. Then, the whispers began anew, soft and inviting, weaving their way into the house's walls like threads of an ancient tapestry. As the family settled into their new home, the radio's whispers grew louder, weaving tales of the house's past. But they did not stop there. One evening, as the couple sat in the living room, they noticed their son staring at a darkened corner of the room. "What's wrong, sweetie?" his mother asked. "There's a man," the boy whispered, pointing. "He says his name is Jacob." The parents exchanged uneasy glances, brushing it off as a child's imagination. But upstairs, in the attic, the radio flickered to life on its own, its whispers now accompanied by a faint, haunting chuckle. The house's curse had never been tied to its walls. It was bound to Jacob himself, and his presence lingered, watching, waiting, for them and for the next to come. Message to the reader. The story of Jacob Monroe is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the perils of digging too deeply into the unknown. Sometimes, the truth is not what we seek, but what seeks us, hungry, relentless, and unforgiving. Jacob's descent into obsession shows us the cost of refusing to let go, of allowing curiosity to morph into compulsion. The mysteries that called to him were never meant to be unraveled, and in his pursuit, he became a part of the very story he sought to uncover. For those drawn to hidden truths, remember this: not all answers bring peace, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved.